God is not conscious. Let me repeat that again. God is not conscious. This is a realization I had last night. God is nothingness. God is pure awareness. Pure yin. There's nothing that God, the ultimate, is aware of. Because the ultimate is nothing. This is how God can be everywhere all at once. Because nothing is inherently everywhere. It is the container from which limitation arises, from which perception arises. You may wonder why, or how can God not be conscious? How could the all-knowing ultimately be nothing? How could it not be aware of itself? Because awareness of the self that is where creation occurs. As soon as the nothingness is aware of itself, creation begins. The universe is born. wonder why do we go to sleep? Why must we sleep? Why do we dream, and why do we sleep a dreamless sleep every night? Because this whole thing is a cycle. And a dreamless sleep is the part of the cycle where we're connected to God, where we're connected to the divine nothingness. The cycles fractal out and are embedded in the infinite layers of reality on multiple scales. Speaking of scales, let's talk about sound. What is a sound? A sound has profound origins, and it can help us to understand God. I was amazed to find out one day that a sound is ultimately made up of blips. That you could take, for example, the sound of a kick drum, and you could speed it up to audio rate by repeatedly playing the kick drum over and over, faster and faster. And eventually those individual boom hits, boom, 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 starts to make a frequency. So these sort of almost instantaneous hits, if repeated long enough and fast enough, become a frequency. Like the tone of A. A. Is that A? I think that's A. Because that's C. Oh. So. Those hits, if played right after another in succession, fast enough, become a frequency. But those individual hits, I said they were almost instantaneous. But what does that mean? If they're not instantaneous, what are they? Zoom in on one individual hit. Boom. Right? A kick drum hit. Boom. And use time. Slow down time until the hit takes up like 10 seconds. and then slow it down even more. You're gonna slow it down so much that guess what? That hit, it's made up of individual hits or oscillations of frequencies. It's made up of blips, ones, zeros, so to speak. Just like it itself was a blip or a 1, 0 to make up the next octave of frequency. So then you look at one of those blips making up the drum hit. Zoom in on that. That's made up of blips. Zoom in on one of those blips. That's made up of blips. And each level of blip is going to sound different. It's going to sound different from the next octave up or the octave down, the octave zooming in further. What's going on? What's going on? We can't pinpoint what a blip is. What has science been doing for the past, 500 years? Maybe its whole lifespan. I don't know how long science has been going on. We've been looking at something called particle physics. Particle physics, where we define everything in terms of a particle. A particle is like a 3D blip. But we just found out that 3D blips are an illusion. There is no such thing as a blip. You zoom in, it's actually made up of more blips. You can actually never define what a blip is because it's self-recursive, fractal in nature. It's infinite. It has infinite depth, above and below. As above, so below. And so we could do it forever. And what is going on? What is going on? I said a blip is a 1 and a 0. But what is the 0? That's the space. That's the space in between each blip. What is the space? That's the nothingness. That's God. From nothingness, a blip arises. And when a blip arises, it can't just arise once. You get one blip, you get infinity with it. Because a blip is self-recursive. A blip is never ending. This is why science is never going to crack God. Crack the code. There is no answer to the universe. The universe is not an equation that can be solved. It's irrational. Meaning it's beyond rational. Rationality is a limitation. In the maths, everywhere you see these variables, x, y, theta, and then you plug in a value into these variables, what are you doing? You're determining an instance. You're solidifying an infinite slice. And you're saying, I'm going to look at this slice right here. What are the values at this slice? So you get an answer for something that's instantaneous. But what do we know about instantaneous? There is no instantaneous. There is no blip. Supposedly a click or a blip makes a frequency, right? Makes up the vibes. The reality that we see before us. Everything is just a certain level of frequency. A certain octave of frequency. The grass, the sky, my hand, this ring, my words, sound, the valley, the world. It's all just different levels of frequency. So going back to what we were saying about blips. Science is based upon blips, instances. But there are no instances in reality. And if there are, you're oversimplifying it. You're not getting the whole truth. Because you've just reduced infinity into a blip. When we zoom into those blips, they're made up of more blips. And each of those blips is made up of more blips. So many blips. And no blip is instantaneous. Subdivisions upon subdivisions upon subdivisions. You'll never get to a root. You'll never find the bottom or the top. You'll never find an endpoint. Reality is endless. It's infinite. It's eternal. We are eternal. And the key to understanding this is time. These cycles I referred to in the beginning. 1, then 0. Up, then down. Yes, then no. These oscillations. These frequencies. All made up of blips. How do you get from 1 to 0? Yes to no, up to down. Time. And what is time? What is time? a shift of energy, a shift of perception, a change, a cycle. These cycles never began, and they will never end. We're on an infinite roller coaster. It never began, and it will never end. This is reality. This is you. This is me. This is everything. This is God. This is nothingness. This is somethingness. This is what astrology is all about. It's about these cycles, big cycles. We look an octave up. We look at the planets, the stars. What are they doing? How long does it take them to do their cycle before they repeat? And then not just the planets and the stars, but then we can look at the yugas, which is looking at our galactic cycle. How long does it take for us to get to the center of the galaxy and then come back around, come back out and come around? That's the next octave up. Takes way longer than a cycle of, say, Mars going around the sun or Earth going around the sun. Do these octaves ever end? These cycles? What about the cycle that the galaxy is taking? The galaxy itself. It's another cycle. What are all these cycles doing? Is it all pointless? Is it leading to anything? The latter. Yes, the latter question. It is leading somewhere. Or you could say it's leading nowhere. It's up to you. But ultimately, the way I see it, we're infinitely on our way to becoming God. We're always on our way to becoming the infinite. Because the infinite is the last step before you get to nothingness. Imagine infinite energy flowing through you, flowing around you. You occupy infinite space across infinite dimensions. Life is a story. So in this part of the story, what do you think happens next? That's right. Nothing. All of this collapses to a single blip. To God. To nothingness. Why do you think that all these irrational numbers show up in math? 3.1415, 9265, etc. That's pi. We got E, 2.718, etc. All these numbers, they go on forever. They're little hints. That the universe is irrational. It's beyond rational. And so it has to show up in math, which is trying to make it rational. But the numbers are a little clue. Nope. Not quite rational. Actually, not even close. And so when we become the nothingness, the absolute ultimate, just before that moment, we will feel whole. We will feel complete. Just about. Because as long as the story's going on, as long as the frequencies are frequencying, as long as time exists and is making everything move, the story's not done. Because there is still perception happening. And if there's still perception happening, it means there is still unconsciousness happening, which means there's some other part of you, some other perception out there that exists that doesn't know what you know, and that part knows what you don't know. These are where archetypes come from. Archetypes of people, archetypes of energy, archetypes of anything. It comes from being a perceiver, which means ultimately that you are not one with the divine. You are not yet nothingness. You have some part to play in the story of life before everything collapses to a single blip, before everything recognizes itself as God, as oneness, before all things unify into this single originating archetype, the nothingness. That's why we'll never feel fully complete while we're here. Because this whole thing is a story. It's our story. It's the story of coming back to ourself, merging everything. This is why they say love is the answer. If there was an answer to reality, it would be love. Because love is the last thing you'll experience before you merge with the nothingness. The more we evolve, the more we unify and merge into higher octaves of ourself, realize more of ourself. It's the archetypes that were split at the divergence, reunifying into the convergence, coming back to be whole again, coming back to God. The more we understand each other, get past our differences, the more we can learn to love each other. The more we love each other, the more we become whole again. The more we become whole again, the closer we're getting to being one with God, the nothingness. The originator. And so then when we get to that nothingness, then we'll just have a long sleep before something spontaneously comes out of that nothingness. And the whole thing starts again. Some blip comes out for some reason or other. And then that blip is like, why am I here? What's going on? And then it goes on the journey, the story that we're all going on, along with all its fellow blips on all octaves of reality, and all the ones that are on its octave of reality that it can perceive. Ooh, slow motion this side. Like they say in the Matrix, it's the question that drives you, Neo. It's the question that drives us. I want to dwell on this concept of love a little bit more. I feel like heat sometimes can be synonymous with love, this feeling of warmth. And if you think about it, what's warmer? When you pour warm water into a pool, you know, like a big pool that you swim in, or when you pour that warm water into a small cup. which one of those is going to feel warmer? A small cup. So this is where science is pretty useful. We notice these kinds of things. It's because that energy that's moving around in the water, in that warm water, if it's closer to itself, it can stay warmer for longer. But when it spreads out into a pool, they're farther apart, they feel more separate, less warmth. So it's in our unification that we have love, that we have power. In our unification, that is where the warmth can reside. Now here's a weird one. The warmth usually dissipates, right? Even though you have warm water in a cup. Eventually it gets cold. Energy stops moving around, after a certain amount of time, it just dissipates. So what's that about? What's that dissipation about? So this is where I'm kind of confused, actually. Because this dissipation it seems like you might be getting closer to nothingness. Because is nothingness warm? It doesn't seem like it would be. But it also isn't cold. So this brings to mind another thing I wanted to talk about. But before I talk about that, I just want to finish this thought. Because I was just saying, the closer you're getting to oneness, right? Unification of all the archetypes. The more love you'll feel, the closer you're getting to God. So that implies that warmth is getting closer to the nothingness. Right? Because coming together, all the archetypes, it's going to be warm. It's going to be more love. Because there's more understanding. That's why you can get closer together. Instead of being separate off in different tribes, attacking each other, trying to survive in your little meat suit, being an individual blip. That seems like that is what takes you to the singularity. Maybe there is no singularity though, because like I said, there is no blip. There is no blip. I just don't know how energy starts getting momentum. Like, I want this all to make sense. I want it to make mathematical sense. Like, at the point of of everythingness, where everything is happening and there's like one consciousness. I feel like we're just getting to a point where we're all merging our consciousness into one consciousness. So there's only one archetype left. When there's one archetype left, there's only one thing you haven't merged with. That's the nothingness. But I also said that the blips never go away. Maybe you can never actually be merged with the nothingness, because the blips never came, the blips never will go. They just have always been here. They're part of the story of life. The oscillation, the frequency, the one and the zero, the Shiva, the Shakti, the nothingness, the somethingness. Maybe something and nothing are inseparable. Maybe God being nothing is only half the story. Maybe being something, being in the dream, is something that's always been happening. Maybe it's gonna always happen, and there is nothing else to it. Nothingness is only part of that dream. It's not the whole part. You can't have nothingness without somethingness. You can't have somethingness without nothingness. They're inseparable. Yin yang. So maybe going back to the cup analogy, the fact that there's warm water in there, the fact that it dissipates, it's just the way that energy happens to work itself out, because everything's cause and effect. What I realize is that when you talk to God, you're really just talking out to nothing, because God is nothing. If you're talking to a deity, you're not talking to God yet, because the deity is still an archetype. It still has flaws. It still has biases. Even if it's a deity that's several octaves above you, that knows way more than you do, and can control, manipulate reality way more than you can. Still an archetype. Still not God. This is where that saying, God is not a bearded man in the sky, comes from. I didn't understand that for the longest time. Like, that didn't really click for me. Like, what does that really mean? It means that God is not like us in the sense that God has, a persona. That was the profound realization I had. That's how I realized that God doesn't perceive, at least not like we do. So anyways, cup analogy. Cause and effect. The energy dissipates. Because why does it dissipate? Because the glass and the surrounding environment is probably colder than the cup. So it's just that those mediums aren't water, so the energy can't flow as freely or as quickly. It has to change its frequency to get into the glass and then to get out into the air. And changing frequency takes time. It takes more time than being amongst your own octave, so to speak. being amongst those that get you, your peers. Water getting water, if you know what I mean. So that makes sense. That makes sense. So I'm glad we sort of got that taken care of. But what was the tangent? I had a tangent that I was going to talk about. Before I got on this whole thing. God, I wish I could remember it. God. We could talk about emergence a little bit. So, variety is the spice of life, right? You look around, you know, there's a lot of different frequencies going on. We got blue, you know, spaciousness. The blue's in the spaciousness. You got green trees that have like fractal branchings going off of it. They're big. They're pretty big. They're bigger than me. And then we got these, you know, golden fields. That have these plants that have dried up that kind of look like trees, that they're fractal a little bit, or they have branches at least, but they're not as big, and they, you know, they're their own thing. They're their own octave. So each octave, basically each level of blippery, if you know what I mean, like, this is when I was talking about you get your peers, you know, because they're like you, they look like you. Each one has a different quality to it, each octave, each level of frequency that you're vibrating at. So that's how we can have trees and you know, flowers and people and sky and space, matter, water, cows, houses. It's all different frequencies, all different levels of blips. So the story of ourself, the story of life, the story of the universe, it's all happening all at once. All the different levels of it, the different levels of perception. It's key to understand. Different levels of perception. What you identify as. Do you identify as a person? Do you identify as a plant? Do you identify as a bee? Do you identify as a tree? Do you identify as the world itself? Do you identify as the sun? Do you identify as the solar system? The galaxy? All these different levels are all happening at the same time. The whole story is all happening at once. At all different octaves. And you're occupying one of those octaves in this life. And there's no end to the number of octaves. Turtles all the way up, turtles all the way down. What they forgot to say in the turtles all the way down thing is that there's also turtles all the way up. There's no end. There's no end. There's no answer to reality. Reality is.